of jurors. It's so large. Would you?
This teenager walked into court laughing like the law couldn't touch him. But less than an hour later, his own father was begging the judge for mercy. The courtroom doors opened slowly as Mason Ryder stepped inside, wearing a designer black suit and a silver chain hanging loosely around his neck. And instantly, people noticed the attitude. Not nervous, not worried, annoyed. That matters, because defendants who feel untouchable often behave differently. Relaxed shoulders, slow walking, arrogant eye contact. Mason looked less like someone facing legal consequences, and more like someone inconvenienced by them. Behind him sat his father, billionaire nightclub owner Victor Ryder, surrounded by expensive attorneys whispering confidently. Across the courtroom sat a trembling older man named Daniel Reeves, school bus driver, 58 years old. Bruises still visible near his jaw. 3 weeks earlier, Mason had been arrested after a violent road rage incident outside an elementary school zone. Witnesses claimed Mason exited his sports car screaming threats before punching Daniel repeatedly in front of terrified children. But here's where things get disturbing. According to police reports, Mason laughed after the attack, and when officers tried arresting him, he allegedly said, "My dad owns this city." The courtroom murmured instantly, classic entitlement psychology. When powerful families protect bad behavior repeatedly, consequences begin feeling optional instead of real. Judge Harper watched Mason silently over her glasses. Notice this carefully. Mason never looked at Daniel once. That's not confidence. That's emotional detachment. People avoiding guilt often avoid human connection entirely because empathy creates pressure they don't want to feel. Then Daniel quietly stood holding medical bills with shaking hands. "My granddaughter was on that bus," he whispered emotionally. "She still cries when she sees black sports cars." And suddenly, the courtroom atmosphere changed. Even some jurors looked disturbed. But Mason? He smirked. At this point, everyone in the room felt it. Something wasn't right with this kid. Then Mason leaned toward his lawyer and muttered something under his breath. But unfortunately for him, the courtroom microphone was still live. "She's just another old judge," he scoffed. "She can be replaced." And just like that, Judge Harper stopped writing. The courtroom fell completely silent. Not ordinary silence, the kind that makes people afraid to even breathe too loudly. Judge Harper slowly removed her glasses and looked directly at Mason Ryder, and for the first time since entering court, his smirk weakened slightly. Now watch this carefully. Real authority rarely reacts emotionally at first. Powerful judges understand that silence creates pressure far more effectively than screaming ever could. "Mr. Ryder," Judge Harper said calmly, "would you like to repeat that statement for the court?" Mason laughed nervously. Classic manipulation tactic. Arrogant people often disguise disrespect as humor once they realize they've crossed a line publicly. "I was joking, Your Honor." But nobody laughed. Not the jury, not the audience, not even his father. Victor Ryder's jaw tightened immediately, while defense attorneys began whispering frantically beside him. Damage control. At this point, they realized something dangerous. Mason's biggest threat wasn't the evidence. It was his ego. Then the prosecutor stood slowly holding a tablet. And here's where things became disturbing. "Your Honor," she said quietly. The defendant's behavior didn't begin that day. Mason's confidence shifted instantly. Tiny reaction, huge meaning. Fear had finally entered the room. The courtroom lights dimmed as security footage appeared on the monitor. Multiple clips, different locations, different dates. In every single video, Mason was threatening someone. Valet workers, restaurant staff, parking attendants. And then came the worst clip. A blurry cell phone video recorded outside the school zone moments before the attack. Mason shoved Daniel against the bus and screamed directly into his face. "You people exist because rich families allow it." Gasps spread across the courtroom, but here's what truly changed everything. The prosecutor zoomed into the background of the footage: children. Terrified children crying inside the school bus windows. And suddenly the case stopped being about assault. It became about fear, about abuse of power, about someone raised believing intimidation was strength. Judge Harper stared at Mason silently, and for the first time all day, he couldn't hold eye contact anymore. The courtroom speakers crackled softly as the cell phone footage replayed again. Children crying, Daniel struggling to protect himself, Mason screaming inches from his face. And then, silence. The prosecutor paused the video at the exact moment Mason pointed toward the terrified kids inside the bus. "Now pay attention here, because this is where courtroom psychology became devastating." Judge Harper wasn't focused only on the assault anymore. She was studying Mason's reactions during the footage. No remorse, no shame, just irritation. That detail mattered, because emotionally detached people often react more strongly to losing control than to hurting others. Then, the prosecutor revealed something nobody expected. There's additional audio recovered from the arrest scene. Mason instantly sat upright. No, too late. The audio began playing through the courtroom speakers, police sirens, officers shouting. Mason resisting arrest. Then suddenly his voice echoed through the room. "My father donates to judges bigger than her." Boom! The courtroom erupted into whispers. Even Victor Ryder looked horrified now. Interesting detail. Notice how he immediately stopped looking at his son after hearing that sentence. That's not anger alone. That's recognition deep down. He realized exactly where Mason learned this behavior. Judge Harper folded her hands slowly. And honestly, that calmness felt terrifying, because experienced judges understand something powerful. Arrogant people destroy themselves fastest when given enough time to speak freely. Then Daniel quietly stood, holding a small drawing in trembling hands. "My granddaughter made this after the attack," he whispered emotionally. The courtroom watched silently as he handed the drawing to the prosecutor. Crayon sketches, a school bus, a crying little girl, and beside Mason's figure, one sentence written shakily in a child's handwriting: "The scary rich man." At this point, the entire courtroom felt it. This case was no longer about status or money. It was about emotional damage. Judge Harper looked directly at Mason. "Do you understand what you've done to those children?" Mason opened his mouth confidently at first, but no words came out, and somehow that silence sounded guiltier than every threat he had made all day. Judge Harper leaned back slowly and stared at Mason Ryder in complete silence, and honestly, that silence felt heavier than the entire trial, because when powerful judges stop speaking, arrogant people are forced to confront something they've avoided their entire lives: themselves. The courtroom remained still. Daniel sat clutching his granddaughter's drawing, while Mason stared downward, jaw tight, hands trembling slightly beneath the defense table. Then Judge Harper finally spoke. "Mr. Ryder, you entered this courtroom believing fear was power." Her voice stayed calm, controlled, sharp. "But intimidation is not strength. It is weakness hiding behind privilege." Boom, the courtroom froze. Even Victor Ryder lowered his head slowly, because deep down, everyone understood the real issue now wasn't only violence. It was entitlement without consequences. Judge Harper continued carefully. "You threatened a working man in front of children. You mocked this court. And perhaps the most tragic part." She paused. is that nobody taught you that respect cannot be purchased. Mason's expression cracked instantly. No smirk now, no arrogance, just panic. Then came the ruling: aggravated assault, mandatory anger rehabilitation, community service, working directly with youth trauma programs, restricted driving privileges. But Judge Harper added something unexpected. "For 1 year," she said firmly, "you will speak publicly at schools about the consequences of intimidation and violence." Mason looked stunned. And psychologically, this was brilliant. Punishment creates fear. Accountability creates transformation. Then Daniel slowly stood, holding the crayon, drawing one last time. The courtroom watched quietly as he faced Mason directly. "My granddaughter doesn't hate rich people," he whispered emotionally. Silence. "She's just afraid of becoming powerless around them." And suddenly, Mason completely broke. Tears filled his eyes instantly as reality finally crushed the image he spent years building around himself. Not a powerful teenager, not untouchable. Just a frightened boy raised to mistake fear for respect. As deputies escorted him away, clips from the courtroom exploded across social media within hours. But strangely, the viral moment wasn't the threats. It wasn't Judge Harper shutting him down. It wasn't even the guilty verdict. It was Daniel's final sentence. "She's just afraid of becoming powerless around them." Because deep down, everyone in that courtroom understood exactly what he meant.